Hello and welcome to the 7th installment of the Stoics. So this week we're going to be looking at the Buddha and a text called the Dhammapada. This recording might end up being slightly longer than previous ones because there's maybe, I guess, a bit more ground that we need to cover so that you know who the Buddha is, how we can consider him a philosopher. We're then going to look at some key parts of the text which you may or may not have been familiar with in the past. And then slightly later on, I want to make a contrast with ideas of fate in Greek Stoicism, because there's an interesting question about ethically how we react to a world that is defined by a number of things that I'm going to sketch out. So this is, well, I'll just give you a sense of where we're at so far. So as mentioned, and as part of our exploration last week, when we were talking about the Book of Ecclesiastes, this course itself has has a hinge in the middle. The first half we looked at classic Greek and Roman Stoicism, the greatest hits. Marcus Aurelius, the fragment in the center that you can see, Zeno Citium, the originator on the right, Seneca, Epictetus, and so on. And then that raised a difficult question for us in terms of what we do with a book like Ecclesiastes, which isn't part of Stoic tradition and may have been written in the 9th century, way earlier. We may see some Stoic resonances. There are even some scholars who say that it may be a Jewish response to Stoicism, but we can't do the same with this text this week, which seems to be possibly from 500 or earlier centuries BCE. So what do we do with that? What do we do with resonances and differences? And what I'd like us to do with the Buddha and the Dhammapada is to see if we can think through one of the problems that's come up quite a bit already, which is the social and communal response to suffering and the transience of existence that we've seen in our previous thinkers. It was called, with Seneca, the George Floyd problem. So quite early on, I sketched out these three kind of processes of Stoic thinking that I've come back to at various points. I'm sure you remember what they are, won't you? Or if it even matters, which I need to persuade you that it does. Self-knowledge was one. Compassion, Manapha, not one that I've heard that much about, but it came up with Marcus Aurelius. And then living with nature, very important to the Greek Stoics, the early Stoics, to live in accordance with nature, to keep your will in harmony with nature. Okay, so we've done all that. I'm not going to go over that again. But I want to bring in some slightly new concepts. Not that new, to be honest. These have come out of my reflections over our Zoom classes. And then some of you have been emailing me, and we've been having interesting correspondence by email about the course and other things. And that's made me think about some things in a bit more depth. So I'll sketch them out here. I don't know if these are 4, 5, and 6. Let's just see. So one that we're going to look at this week in particular is transience. Well, I should say, where am I getting at with these? Well, the processes of Stoic thinking, or the problems in which that Stoic thinking responds to. We're going to spend a lot of time this week thinking about the transience or impermanence of existence. In the words of Kohelet, the main narrator in the Book of Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. So transience is one. Now another, which came up a little bit with our Roman Stoics and their preoccupation with ethics, like Epictetus, is training, or disposition, I'm calling it. Now in Epictetus, there's a big focus in the handbook, at least, at identifying and responding to the things that are up to us. So we need to kind of train our awareness and our disposition accordingly so that we can understand and we can respond to the things that are within our power. And part of that then leads into something that we've kind of alluded to at many different points, that what characterizes Stoic thinking is philosophy being not merely about a study of nature, but it's about how we live in nature, and it's therefore a way of life. Now, the number 6, or number 3 of these new things that I want to consider is the role of fate. What do we do ethically in a universe where we take the view, as the Stoics did, that everything is determined by a prior cause? So, what space have we got to kind of act or react? When we see suffering in the Buddha's kind of vision, endless cycles of suffering, what do we do with that? Is that simply fated, or can we respond? Well, the Buddha and our Greek and Roman Stoics believe we can respond, but we need to drill into this a little bit. What does fate mean, and what is our freedom within fate? So anyway, these three are things that I want us to try and fill out a bit, and I want you to think about a bit as I'm talking and recording this. Okay, so the agenda for this week, we're looking at the Buddha. We'll explain this image in a moment. First of all, we need to meet this man. Man, or is he a deity? A man. We're going to meet this man. We're going to think about who he was, when he was, and how we can consider him a philosopher. We're then going to look at the text that I asked you to read most of, which is the Dhammapada. And then the rest of this kind of class is structured around various arguments in the Dhammapada. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive account at all. There's so much that's interesting and rich there. I'm just going to pick out some bits that I think are useful for what we're already focused on. So part 3, we're going to look at the problem of suffering, which is pretty key to this. We're then going to think about the role of reason or awareness, watchfulness, and the analogy to swimming upstream, which is presented in this text. We're then going to make some contrast briefly with Greek Stoicism. We're going to look at Chrysippus. We're going to talk a bit more about fate. I feel like when it comes to Greek Stoicism, we didn't quite cover everything that we could have covered. So I want to just backtrack on that. And then in the final part, we're going to look at the role of compassion, which is pretty central to the Buddha's message and usefully bears on number 2 or whatever that list I just gave you. Okay, right, let's see how we go. So in this first bit, I want to just go over the Buddha's life, and we're going to begin by thinking about to what extent he's a philosopher. Okay. Right, so here he is, looking ponderous over a pond. So you may have come across, I'm sure you probably have, Buddhism before this. You may or may not have read Buddhist scriptures. You probably will be aware of the Buddha as an image and the things that we associate in a very general and popular way with Buddhism, like the idea of karma, or kind of a view of existence that involves reincarnation, maybe enlightenment, nirvana, escaping reincarnation, and so on. Now, there's a problem that immediately bears on what we're doing, which had a big bearing on the discussion of the Book of Ecclesiastes, which is that we're taking what could be called something from wisdom literature, ancient wisdom literature, and we are reading it through a secular philosophical tradition, which is Stoicism, which might be wrong, mightn't it? I mean, what do we do with something like Buddhism or the author, the Buddha? What does it mean to kind of read him as a philosopher when in many parts of the world he is seen as a deeply sacred figure associated with a lot of kind of supernatural abilities? Now, there are over 500 Buddhists across the world, many in Asia, Japan, Cambodia, like China, Tibet, of course. So what do we do? How do we can we just appropriate him as a secular philosopher? Well, that's tricky. And there certainly was a tradition of doing this in the 19th and the early 20th century, of just stripping away all the mysticism and looking at the kind of the doctrines in terms of epistemology and so on. But that's risky, and I'm not sure we should do that. And then, as you probably can see on this image in front of us, there's this kind of very Western image of the Buddha on the one. There's on the left, there are an image of some Buddhist monks in their orange or yellow robes. And then on the right, there's a bit of garden furniture, which many of us have. I don't have, but lots of people have of Buddha statues. And the imagery of the Buddha, kind of relaxing on a lotus leaf, sometimes, very fat and very cheerful and so forth. So what are we doing with the Buddha? Well, at least in terms of this, over the next hour or so, we're not going to, while the Buddha is associated with all sorts of supernatural qualities, it was said that he could walk on water, he could fly, he was able to walk and talk straight after his birth and so on. We're not going to comment on those, and there's a lot about his life that we'll get into in a second, which seems surrounded by elements which seem supernatural or impossible in different ways, communicating with different deities and so on. Now, it would be arrogant to just debunk that really quickly. We're going to respect that these beliefs are historically significant, and they're an important way to think about the sanctity of the Buddha to Buddhists all around the world. In the same way that we might think about the Jesus' sayings versus Jesus' miracles. But what we'll try and do with the Dhammapada, and this is what I hope you will have done with the reading, is to kind of think about the Buddha here as a deeply enlightened man, as somebody who's producing a philosophy which hinges largely around the mind's ability to understand itself and the world. At the same time, and this will probably come up with Spinoza in a few weeks, perhaps if he was around now, maybe he would have been completely secular. We just don't know that. And you will have noticed in places the existence of the gods alluded to in this, and Buddhism doesn't deny the existence of the gods. But what is interesting is this great emphasis on the human mind's thinking ability, which is not quite there with the god statues. So here he is, the Buddha. There's a little bit of disagreement actually in the last 20 years about his exact dates. 500 BC, roughly around that time. I thought I'd just give you a small quotation to get us started. Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, unless it agrees with your own reason. I just wanted to have that in there briefly because it might not be the sort of thing we would expect to hear from the Buddha. We might be expecting somebody who wishes to instill some sort of obedience in the monks, who kind of, has all these kind of supernatural motifs in his thinking. But no, there is an emphasis on the power of reason. So for the next hour or so, humour me, let's treat the Buddha as a kind of philosopher. Okay, right, we're now going to look at the Buddha's life. This is actually, this image here is from the Buddha's life. This is where he cuts off his hair. You can see this actually if you look just to the right of all the figures who are kind of looking adoringly at the Buddha. He's cutting off his hair. It's like a long ponytail. And this is a sign of him renouncing the secular world and becoming an ascetic. So maybe in that sense, one way that we can see the Buddha, and this is the image that I had at the beginning, is somebody who is an ascetic, and who can be seen in an ascetic or a kind of wandering spiritual seeker tradition, and therefore somebody who almost might possibly reminiscent of something like Parmenides, the pre-Socratic, or Pythagoras, or the Pythagoreans, somebody who kind of straddles both philosophy and mysticism, self-renunciation and initiation into higher knowledge in different ways. Okay, I'll stop waffling. Let's get into his life. Okay, so the Buddha. Well, you might have read a lot about this already. I'll just kind of give you the key facts. So he's born in a royal family in northeast India. Well, what is then kind of culturally northeast India. It's now Nepal, in the 6th century BC. His name at birth is Siddhartha Gautama, or Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama. He's born in the same century as Confucius and a century before Socrates. Does that matter? Well, we could perhaps see something interesting in that. His parents, and the baby in the image here is the Buddha. His parents are king and queen, King Suddhodana and Queen Maya. Now, the parents are warned at birth that this Siddhartha is going to become a holy man, and so they don't want him to become a holy man. They want him to kind of continue ruling and to keep the dynasty going. So they try and hide the things that might cause him to become holy: sickness, old age, and death. And these eventually become known as the Siddhartha ends up seeing these things. He ends up seeing old age. He ends up seeing sickness. He ends up seeing death. You can kind of see that in this slightly cheesy kind of, I don't know what you call it, kind of 4 images. But then this moment when he does see these things is known as the 4 sights, like 4 sights of Buddhism, 4 sights of the Buddha. And then the final one in the bottom right is when he sees a holy man, an ascetic, and he's kind of struck by his devotion. But if we're thinking about our tradition here, we had Marcus, the Roman emperor. We had Ecclesiastes, traditionally written by King Solomon. And then we have this, another ancient piece of wisdom literature, or kind of pioneer of an ancient discourse of wisdom, who also comes from a very royal, powerful background. It'd be interesting to see how much we might read the Buddha's work in relation to that or not. We certainly did that with Marcus and Seneca. As Madhu reminded us last week and in previous weeks, we're going to we'll keep our focus on the tale, not the teller. But it's interesting that the Buddha, in terms of his life, is deliberately shielded from these things. So he spends the first 29 years of his life in the royal capital of this region. This clan are called the Sakya clan. The capital is called Kapilavastu. Probably don't need to know that. I'll just give you too much information here. And he has a wife, and he has a very young son called Rahula. So after he ends up being exposed kind of accidentally to these things, and then he sees the monk, he decides that he's going to become an ascetic. And that's, this is when he makes this decision. He cuts off his hair and his beard, he puts on the robe, and he kind of manages a nighttime escape from the palace where he's being held prisoner because they don't want him to escape. He abandons his wife and he abandons his son Rahula as well. So what happens next for the Buddha? Well, this is him in this image. It's part of the same kind of series of images. I think from Myanmar, Burmese art. He's kind of in this image. He's kind of saying goodbye to his son and his wife, and he's off to go basically. So he decides to become an ascetic, and he studies under one spiritual teacher and then another. And then, as far as the story goes, he quickly learns everything that they can teach. They offer him leadership of their groups, but he doesn't want to do it. So there's an interesting thing here. This image here is of the Buddha looking very haggard. He decides that he's not going to follow these teachers, but he's going to continue being kind of living a monastic life, I suppose, being ascetic. And he decides that he's going to starve himself. Self-mortification, it's called, in order to achieve a state of enlightenment. And so he does this, and he becomes more and more sick, so much so that it's said that his backbone nearly touches his belly button or something, which is quite a horrible image. But then, he kind of realizes that this isn't working for him either. There's an interesting thing to kind of point out here. So he's studies under two different spiritual teachers. Then he is starving himself basically, and he's got a small group of followers, 5 followers. And in both cases, he backs away, and he says that this isn't going to work because what the teachers are offering with their meditation, and what starvation is or people seeking enlightenment offer sought through starvation, is it's only going to lead to a form of personal salvation for yourself and not for the rest of humankind. And it's this kind of universal plane that he is kind of more interested in, what it would mean to end suffering, understand suffering and end suffering for all. Now, sometimes this is slightly different, but sometimes he is compared to Aristotle in what he advocates. So he decides that he's not going to starve himself. He has a normal meal after this realization, and he famously sits under a body tree, and he decides that he's going to meditate here, and he's either going to find enlightenment or he's going to die. And then it's in this kind of deep meditation under the tree that he ends up experiencing enlightenment. And there are loads and loads of images of this. And part of this kind of awakening is that he recognizes and comes up with a solution to the problem of suffering. This is supposedly the actual tree. What he also ends up doing, and this explains the Aristotle link, is he says that in order to reach enlightenment, we need to kind of pursue a middle way that is neither about sensuous over gratification, nor is it about living in a totally ascetic, self-starving, self-punishing way. And he comes up with other teachings like the Eightfold Path, which we'll talk about too. And he ends up he has this kind of vision of how the monk should live, and it isn't one that is completely detached from what we need, but it's rather it's indifferent. It's indifferent to sensual pleasure. It's indifferent to food. It won't say no, but it's not going to get too attached. Now, indifference, you'll remember those, won't you, from the Greek Stoics? It's a big part of what they had to say, and it's something that differed them from the Cynics. Aristotle also talks about the importance of the golden mean, of living in a way that is between virtue and vice, not to strive to be too virtuous. That, as far as Aristotle is concerned, that is impossible. Okay, so the Buddha spends spends a long time, I think apparently 7 weeks, contemplating under the tree, and he's organizing his insights and his discoveries. And at first he's reluctant to teach other people because he thinks it'll be too difficult. And then a deity comes, the Brahma Sampati, who approaches the Buddha and says, on behalf of all beings, please, could you teach us the way? Could you teach us the Dhamma? Yes, some beings might not be willing or interested in your message of the renunciation of desire, but don't worry, some might be. Some, and he says, have only got a little bit of dust in their eyes, and if you can teach it, then that dust will be cleared. And so the Buddha, out of compassion for all beings, agrees to teach his teachings. And so he begins by teaching the 4 people that had been around him when he was starving himself. When the Buddha decides that he's not going to starve himself anymore, they're so disappointed with him that they abandon him. But now he finds them and he teaches them the 4 noble truths, and then they become they kind of reach a higher plane of enlightenment too. And kind of soon after, various other key doctrines of Buddhism are apparently formulated. One of them is called the 3 refuges, or jewels, the 3 jewels of Buddhism. Number 1 is the Buddha himself, on the idea of the Buddha's enlightenment. Number 2 is the Dharma, the teachings. And number 3, I think of this image, it's the people all around the Buddha. It's the monks, it's the Sangha, the monastic community. So what happens then? He's reached enlightenment. God has said, please teach everyone. And so he does this, and now he's got some followers. Well, maybe this is what makes what the Buddha is doing quite interesting, I suppose. That when he reaches enlightenment, he doesn't just kind of like levitate into the sky and never come back. He's not. He doesn't go into the next life. He stays on Earth because he's a human being. Remember, he's not deified. He stays on Earth teaching for another 45 years. So I should have said this earlier. He experiences enlightenment at the age of 35, and so he spends the next 45 years teaching. He travels around northern India on foot. He teaches people from all different social backgrounds and classes, and he does this until the age of 80, and then he's feeling the effects of old age. So he decides that he's going to go to a grove of trees, and when he sits under a couple of these trees, they suddenly blossom, even though it's out of season. And we can assume that his followers are all around him at the same time. And he says to his followers this important, final words. Conditioned things are by nature perishable. Attain your goal through awareness. So the Buddha dies at that point, and what happens next is a council of monks are convened, and I think about 500, and what they do is they meet and they recite what they could remember and what they'd understood of the Buddha's teachings, and this ends up becoming the Pali Canon, which is like it's the oral traditions of the Buddha's life and his teachings. And this is an oral tradition that's passed down through speech and recitation. It's interesting here to think about the format of the Dhammapada, the verses, and it's taught orally for several centuries until it is written down in the form that we know today. Now, the Pali Canon is associated with the Theravada tradition of Buddhism, which is the most prevalent, and it's the oldest surviving school of Buddhism, although it's not the only one. And it's now mainly associated with Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. Okay, so this is the overview of the Buddha's life. And I just wanted to kind of present this really just finally, that maybe what makes the Buddha really interesting is that the images often vary so much, from a laughing fat Buddha to the emaciated, self-starving Buddha. And the figure in the middle almost looks like something that you might expect, like a stone sculpture of, say, one of Jesus Christ's disciples, that you might come across in an Italian church. There are these many different images of the Buddha. And yeah, I suppose the Buddha that we're going to be looking at is the Buddha of the Dhammapada, which is part of the early Buddhist tradition. And it's the part which has become less interlinked with supernatural stories and so forth. Okay, right. Part 2. Let's talk about this text, the Dhammapada. So we have that scene where the 500 disciples are meeting together to recite and remember the Buddha's key teachings. They are led by a guy called Ananda, who is the Buddha's assistant. And what they do is they come up with what they call the 3 baskets of teachings, because these would end up becoming writings that were stored in baskets. I'll show you some in a second. And so, as they come up with the 3 baskets, or the 3 like domains, 3 foundations of the Buddha's teachings. The one is called the Vinaya Pitaka. The second is the Sutta Pitaka, and the third is the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Because this might be all quite new to you, what you need to know is the Vinaya Pitaka is all about how to run a monastery. It's monastic teachings, how monks should live. And then the Sutta Pitaka is what we're going to look at, which is the Dhammapada is from this. And the Sutta Pitaka relates to Buddha's teachings, memorable sayings, and so forth and so forth. These are, if you're picturing the baskets, the Tipitaka, the 3 baskets, then you can imagine this here, like the texts are on these kind of long, thin bits of wood, almost like kind of cards. And yeah, so the Dhammapada is part of the Sutta Pitaka, and it takes the form of 423 verses in 26 chapters. Now, the oldest manuscript that we've got of the Dhammapada is from the year 1500 AD, 1500 C, which is not that old. But it seems that, a kind of a written form of it goes back to 500 CE. And probably earlier. It's just very difficult to kind of to date. So this puts a bit of a question mark over how old is the Dhammapada. The Buddha himself, 500 BC. But this text here, the one that we're working with, is nearly 1,000 years later. We might assume that it was kind of orally understood and transmitted and maybe written down, I don't know, several centuries after, but we can't be sure basically. So for now, for our purposes, we'll please take the view that this slightly predates. No, this comes before Greek Stoicism, just a little bit, just slightly before Socrates. Okay, so the Dhammapada, what does it mean? Well, let's just look at the title itself. So, Dhamma, teachings or doctrine, pada, path. So some people translate Dhammapada as meaning like the path to the truth, or the path, or the way to the truth. But pada can also mean like foot, like kind of feet, kind of elements of the truth. There's also a distinction to be made, which doesn't really translate, but we need to keep it in mind, between Dhamma and Dhamma, between basically capital D and lowercase d. Capital D, Dhamma, is the teachings of the Buddhas. You'll be thinking of the Buddhas, and what I mean here is, as far as the Buddha taught it, he, as they did in Hindu society, believed in reincarnation, and so he believed that there were previous Buddhas that were born before him. So the Dhamma, with capital D, is the teachings of the Buddhas, but then Dhamma, lowercase d, is any mental state. And so the two are kind of linked in that you can refine and train and exercises in training your mental state so that they can become one with what the Buddha teaches. Now, this is a work from an oral culture. So these are verses that are meant to be remembered, they're meant to be recited, they're meant to be simple, they're meant to be persuasive. And just a couple more concepts that will come up a little bit later. The Buddha is focused on the problem of suffering in a world of samsara, which is a universe in which beings die and are reborn. So it's our universe. It's It's the world that we inhabit too now. But the kind of the key underlying premise, I suppose, is that reincarnation happens. You know, that human beings are reincarnated. All living things are reincarnated in different ways. Now, the Buddha also wants us to evade or overcome a figure called Mara. Now, Mara is a renegade god who has imprisoned all beings in this samsara, in this conditioned world of birth and death and rebirth. Now, Mara keeps us stuck in the cycle through our attachments to desire and to fear. So this is what the Buddha wants us to kind of be aware of. This is part of the training. This is the exercise. Wisdom is going to help us conquer fear by recognizing the nature of suffering. So the edition that I want us to look at, and if you're watching this on YouTube and you're not part of the course, the set reading is basically chapters 1 to 20 of the Dhammapada, which is basically 3/4 of it. Doesn't include the final quarter. And the translation that I wanted us to look at was the Juan Mascaro translation, which is not the most up-to-date, by Penguin. And it's quite new agey. This is one of the criticisms. Mascaro translates the Dhammapada in the early 1970s. And he'd previously made, well-regarded translations of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, which are key sacred texts in the Hindu tradition. And I just wanted to show you, this is from a Spanish magazine. It's looking at Juan Mascaro, the spiritual guide, the Mallorcan spiritual guide of the Beatles. Apparently George Harrison knew him or spoke with him. If you read the introduction, which it wasn't part of the reading that set you, you'd have to get this by the Penguin book. It makes some really wonderful contrast between the Dhammapada and Christianity and Christian mystical writings and Sufism and the Upanishads and other places, Wordsworth, Rabindranath Tagore. He's a wonderful figure, Juan Mascaro. And part of why I wanted to give you the Mascaro translation, not the more recent one by Valerie Roebuck, is because there's something about the way that he writes that he kind of captures the the enticing spiritual atmosphere in which one could be kind of more receptive to these teachings. This might sound like New Age guff, so I need to persuade you more, don't I? I'm going to show you actually a kind of before and after, the two different translations against each other. Anyway, let me now start telling you about about what the Dhammapada is trying to do. So I want you to think here about chapter 1 of the Dhammapada, and my recommendation is that you have a go at reading the Dhammapada before you listen to this, but you don't have to. Okay, so I've got in mind here the very beginning of the Dhammapada. So remember, our Stoics talk about philosophy as a form of medicine. Epictetus talked about his school as a doctor's clinic. This is philosophy that's going to heal us. It's going to heal our souls. Now, it might be interesting to think about the Dhammapada as a treatment or as a therapy to a problem. And that problem is the problem of desire, or the problem of attachment or craving. Desires become addictive. We crave things that we enjoy. And this ends up leading to suffering. We become vulnerable. We become hooked. We become dependent. Now, it's this problem of desire that Dhammapada wants to kind of focus on, and it wants us to kind of understand. And part of what it's got to say is that the problem of desire comes from a mistaken understanding of ourself, of what ourself is. So let's think a little bit about the way that the Dhammapada begins. I'll quote, "What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind." So I want you to think, what's at stake in a statement like this, or even in the first chapter of this? Immediately you might be thinking of Epictetus. To say that our life is the creation of our minds is reminiscent of Epictetus' focus, not on what happens to us, but what we think about what happens to us. Now, there's an emphasis on acting, and here kind of, well, not here, but slightly later in chapter 1, with acting and speaking with a pure mind. And there are things within this text where we might think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to speak with a pure mind? What is purity? Again, we've had these questions when we looked at the previous Stoic text. What's nature? What's truth? For now, let's just keep in mind here the aim of what this text is trying to do, which is its kind of teachings. Now, chapter 1 provides us all some other teachings that, they come thick and fast, so you might miss them. So let's just kind of remind ourselves of them. It calls on us to free ourselves from hate, to love. Now, that's important. This isn't a life that's cold. Well, not totally cold. To live in harmony with others. To cultivate the power of virtue through detachment from Mara being the cause of fear, suffering, regulation of the passions, and pursuing the path of happiness and joy. Now, the way it's translated can give slightly different inflections to this. Let's just see. You can make up your own mind. So, Juan Mascaro, 1973 translation is on the right. Now, let's look at Valerie Roebuck, Penguin, and from last 10-15 years. You'll notice that the chapter title is something different, rather than contrary ways it's twins. And the writing is much more kind of dense. Forerun by mind are mental states, ruled by mind, made of mind. If you speak or act with corrupt mind, suffering follows you, as the wheel the foot of the ox. What I've done in this, as part of my preparation, is I've compared Mascaro to Roebuck. So I'll point out more useful contrasts as we go along. If you're interested in a more accurate translation, Roebuck is best. I still prefer Mascaro. Anyway, let's just go back to these first two, I don't know what we should even call them, verses, first two verses. So what we get here is a focus on human consciousness and our ability to modify it, which is what reminded me of Epictetus a moment ago. You'll also notice that it calls on an awareness of the future consequences of our disposition now. You remember disposition, I mentioned that at the beginning. Now this disposition could be motivated by good or bad, by hope or fear or resentment. Overall, it views society in terms of relations, that we are defined by our mental states, but we live in a world that is of other people, and we have a kind of great responsibility to other people. We should feel compassion towards them, feel responsibility to them. We should strive to live in harmony with them. There is something remarkable about those first two lines. Our life is the creation of our mind. Mascaro in the second part. If a man speaks or acts with a pure mind, joy follows him as his own shadow. Now, one way to think about what is happening here at the very beginning of the Dhammapada is to think of it as a development from sacred texts which kind of predate the Buddha, and it's a tradition that he's responding to. If you want to kind of think of a very broad comparison, you might want to think of the way that Jesus Christ, emerges in a Jewish society as a Jewish man, but ends up developing an outlook and set of teachings which are not quite Jewish and end up becoming their own tradition. We see the same with the Buddha and Hinduism. So when the kind of focus on a mental state is reminiscent of the law of karma or kama, that it is the intention or the mental state with which an act is performed that causes its consequences. So what we're kind of seeing here is that we are what we are thinking. You are what you think. Now, this might all be kind of new stuff. This is why this recording is probably going to be a little bit longer than the previous ones, because this is a shift from Hinduism. Now, in Hinduism, thinking here of like a text like the Upanishads, one of the things that is central is the concept of the Atman. Now, the Atman is first presented in a work called the Rig Veda, which is one of the oldest kind of sacred writings which dates anywhere from 1200 BC to 1700 BC. So it's much older than anything that we're looking at. Now, in the Rig Veda, the Atman is kind of like soul, but not quite. it's like our essential self, but it's not like our ego, it's not like our selfish drives or that kind of persona. It's like our essential being. Now in Hinduism, if we truly know Atman, our essential self, then we can achieve liberation from reincarnation. So that's what it's striving for. Now there's different traditions in Hinduism of viewing Atman, and this is usually in relation to another concept, Brahman. So we have Atman and Brahman. And Brahman is it's in a crude way you could compare it to an understanding of God. Brahman is that which is infinite, it is eternal, it is the underlying force of all things. So we have Atman, which is our essential self, which Hinduism wants us to discover. And then we have Brahman, which is this kind of infinite cosmic force, which is the foundation of life. So in Hinduism, if we know Atman, then we're going to achieve liberation from reincarnation. We know our essential self. But that's not present, is it, in the Dhammapada? Where did you read about the essential self? Nowhere. This Atman, this idea of a kind of a fixed self, is an illusion. Because what we are is our mental state. That's what the first two verses are getting at. Our life is the creation of our mind. It's dynamic. It's in the present. There's nothing to find, nothing to seek. This is from the Rig Veda. So let me quote from the Chandogya Upanishad, where we get this kind of sense of Brahman, Atman, because this is what the Buddha is dissolving here. This is from the Upanishad. As the rivers flowing east and west merge in the sea and become one with it, forgetting they were separate rivers, so do all creatures lose their separateness when they merge at last into pure being. There is nothing that does not come from him. Of everything, he is the inmost self. So he is the truth. He is the self supreme. You are that Shvetaketu. You are that. As you know, my pronunciation is terrible, even for English. Okay, so I should probably explain at least some of these images, shouldn't I? So this is an image of the deity Shiva bearing the descent of the Ganges River, and it's from like a Hindu manuscript. So the Buddha, rather than talking about Atman, is talking about, well, there's no Atman. It's like a no self, an anti-self, or anatta. Now I know this is a slightly deep dive quite quickly, but it's interesting to think about what the self is, at least in terms of these two verses, if our life is the creation of our mind. And teaching in Buddhism, it's not quite there in the Dhammapada, it comes up elsewhere. It's this idea that the self isn't like an essence, it's something that is the product of different processes in us, and it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, it's dynamic. It's fluid, it's not atom-like, if that makes sense. So Buddhism teaches that the self is made up of 5 aggregates, and these are the body, the form of matter, number 1. 2 are sensations or feelings. These are seen as equivalent. 3 are perceptions. 4, mental activity. And 5, consciousness. They might all sound kind of similar in the Western tradition, but there's more of a distinction in Buddhism. And there's a great discussion of this actually in Julian Baggini's book, How the World Thinks, which is like a guide to all philosophy, like all around the world. And there's a great discussion of what no self means, anti-self, anatta. And Baggini draws on a text from the 1st century BC called The Questions of King Milinda. And here, basically, they're having a debate about what the self is. And the priestess in this compares it to a chariot. Even as the word of chariot means that members join to frame a whole, so when the groups appear to view, we use the phrase a living being. Now, in the Western tradition, we have the ship of Theseus, the ship of Theseus paradox. And this goes from a ship that was apparently in Athens, from like a military victory that they kept, to kind of celebrate it. And what they would do in order to stop the ship rotting, to have it open as like a public monument, is they kept replacing the planks and parts over time. And then eventually someone very clever said, well, with everything on a ship has been changed over the centuries in order to stop it from rotting. So is it still the same ship? Well, on one level, it is the same ship because it still has the same kind of, taken as a totality, God, I'm not explaining it, am I? Taken as a totality, it has a kind of continuity with the past. But all of the specific parts have all changed. And this is what's going off here with the idea of the chariot. What is it? The self is what we think of as our self is not a fixed thing. It's a consequence. In neuroscience, it is an emergent property of the complexity of the parts that make it up. Baggini makes a nice contrast here to David Hume and David Hume's theory that the self is merely a bundle of impressions. If you want to know more about that, take a look at the Baggini book. I'll try and remember to put a link up on Moodle. Okay, so this is all. Well, what I'll do here is discuss some more kind of teachings of the Buddha aside from this. This is from an 18th century manuscript from Thailand outlining the virtues of the Buddha. You'll often see in some of them there is the kind of living harmoniously with animals as well. So one of the kind of key things of Buddhism is the Eightfold Path. You might want to keep in mind here that the ways that Buddhism is, these kind of early messages are all things that are quite memorable, aren't they? An Eightfold Path, Four Noble Truths, the Three Jewels, and so on. Now, if we follow the Eightfold Path, we'll achieve a state of enlightenment. But I want you to think about these, because do these sound like mystical virtues, or do they actually sound like the features of a rationalist philosophy? Right view, right intent. I should say sometimes right view is translated as right understanding, right intent. Right speech, right focus, right alertness, right purpose, right effort, right motivation. We also get the Four Noble Truths. Here they are. And they all hinge around suffering and desire. Number one, dukkha. Suffering is an inherent part of existence from birth through sickness and old age to death. Reflects the things that the Buddha was concealed from. So that's number one. Second truth, the cause of suffering is desire. We'll look at this more in the next section. 3, we can do something about it. The suffering can be ended by detaching oneself from craving and attachment, nirodha. Number 4, just follow the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the means to eliminate desire and overcome the ego. Ego is, again, not a term that the Buddha would have used in the way that we understand, but the kind of the self-interested part of ourselves, we could say. Okay, so this is my bit on the Dhammapada. We're now going to start getting stuck into some of the doctrines, because this is going to be a slightly longer recording, I think. Feel free to have a tea break at home at any point. Right, let's talk about suffering, I'm afraid. So Buddhism, the Dhammapada is responding to the problem of suffering. The endless cycles of suffering. Samsara. So the Buddha is distraught at these endless cycles through an existence that is defined by suffering and transience. And what he strives to do, and what the teachings are here, is to escape the transience. And this is what he's trying to, make the case for. Now, unlike other mystical traditions, or unlike, the monotheistic religions in our culture, the way that we're going to escape suffering is ourselves. It's not going to be through sacrifices, which are a major part of Hinduism. And it's not going to be through, prayer or anything like this. Well, not through prayer alone. It's not going to be through the generosity of the saints. It's going to be through our own virtue. Virtue outlasts transience. Verse 151, the virtue of the good never grows old. In fact, we get these kind of moments about halfway through the reading where the Buddha is describing this kind of endless reincarnation of lives defined by transience and suffering. And then he has this moment where he recognizes the structure. And when he recognizes the structure, when he recognizes the house builder, as he calls it, then he knows the nature of life and death. I'll read it to you. This is verses 154 and 155, and then I'll make a comment about mortality. It's 153 to 154. I have gone round in vain the cycles of many lives ever, striving to find the builder of the house of life and death. How great the sorrow of life that must die! But now I have seen thee, house builder, never more shalt thou build this house. The rafters of sin are broken, the ridgepole of ignorance is destroyed, the fever of craving is past, for my mortal mind is gone to the joy of the immortal nirvana. Now, this isn't obviously isn't from the Book of Ecclesiastes, but think about the things that are highlighted there. The recognition that we must die. This, in the awareness of this, ignorance is destroyed. Craving is dropped. It's always the Dhammapada and a lot of these teachings more broadly are a response to the same things that our narrator in Ecclesiastes was interested in and despaired about, which is mortality, isn't it? That he looks at all things under the sun and all is vanity. You know, nothing outlasts really our lives. We have no control over what happens next. There are so many things that we cannot understand. But Kohelet, the narrator of Ecclesiastes, backs away. He says we need to eat, drink, and be merry, love our wife, live a life of friendship, of two rather than one, and accept things as they are. But what the Buddha is doing is kind of different. It isn't simply accepting things as they are. There is a belief in the power of wisdom. Wisdom isn't vanity. Wisdom is what is going to help us attain this state of enlightenment where we recognize suffering and mortality and we are no longer perturbed by it. Now let's talk a little bit about the body in this, because there are lots of obvious contrasts with what we've looked at previously. I'm thinking here of Marcus Aurelius. So the Buddha describes the body as a useless log which will be cast aside in death. It is frail like a jar. It is described as the foam of a wave, the shadow of a mirage. We get this a lot in chapter 11 too, quite memorably. There's also an interesting question here. When we think about the Buddha or Marcus, about this kind of coldness about the body, this disassociation from the body. In chapter 11, the Buddha describes the body as a house of bones, a nest of diseases, something that is as disposable as gourds. Gourds are basically like pumpkins and cucumbers. Gourds in autumn. In particular, passages 146 to 149. Now, there's a lot of sorrow here, isn't there? There is a lot of sorrow and sadness in the Dhammapada. There's a lot of solitude as well. 146, quote, "How can there be laughter? How can there be pleasure when the whole world is burning? When you are in deep darkness, will you not ask for a lamp? Consider this body, a painted puppet with jointed limbs, sometimes suffering and covered with ulcers, full of imaginings, never permanent, forever changing. All life ends in death." Now that is reminiscent of the ways that Marcus would chide himself to remember that he is just a part in an infinitesimally greater whole. His life is totally insignificant. But then he uses that not to kind of, seek escapism in wine, but instead to kind of recognize the harmony of nature, that there is purpose and structure here. It's just not Marcus-centered. It's just not human-centered. And there's something kind of similar here with what the Buddha has to say. Now there's an emphasis on transience being an evil and a source of sadness, but also potentially at times a source of beauty. The flowers of life, the perfume that comes with a virtuous life, think about the ways, this is I think chapter 4, the sensual ways, but this kind of the sensual enchantment with life, with nature, which also comes up in the Dhammapada. Just as we become non-attached to our bodies, we become more substantially attached to the beauty of nature in its cycles and in its seasons and in its transience, which is no longer a pain or a source of despair to us, as it is for Kohelet and Ecclesiastes, for the source of joy. Kohelet in Ecclesiastes says that we cannot escape our time, just as fish cannot escape an evil net, or birds a snare. But it's interesting, we get the same imagery in the Dhammapada, but there's a kind of note of optimism about birds being captured, but freedom. 174. This world is indeed in darkness, and how few can see the light. Just as few birds can escape from a net, few souls can fly into the freedom of heaven. And yet there is an emphasis on the possibility of flight, of swimming to enlightenment, of a striving which gets us somewhere. When we recognize, that everything is a bubble, is froth, but is beautiful, then the king of death is said to have no power over us. Now, this image here is a manuscript. I can't remember what it's from. This is from the Marcus class, isn't it? But the writing's in Arabic. God knows why I picked that. But this is an image clue in my mind of the way in which Marcus wants us to view us as limbs of a collective body, as parts of nature, as a huge, thriving collective organism. Now, Marcus's wisdom simply gets him to a greater understanding of mortality and perhaps a greater appreciation of, we might say, the miracle of life. And maybe there's something like that here in the Dhammapada in a different way. There's an emphasis on the path. The image of the path comes up a lot. The image of the path comes up in Spinoza's Ethics. He talks about the path of the ethics. All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare, but some might reach the end of the path. I guess the image of the path is just something that we get in different mystical writings. Now, for the Buddha, the path involves effort. It's not just going to be about smoking holy herbs or saying the right prayers. It involves meditation and mental vigilance, deep contemplation. We get this at the end of chapter 20. The recognitions. Once you recognize, proceeding on the path doesn't involve any physical movement. It's mental movement. 277. Quote, all is transient. When one sees this, he is above sorrow. This is the clear path. All is sorrow. When one sees this, he is above sorrow. This is the clear path. All is unreal. When one sees this, he is above sorrow. This is the clear path. Transient, unreal, insubstantial, an illusion, a delusion. Once you recognize the world as merely mental appearances, mental impressions, as Epictetus would say, phantasiae, then we are no longer under their spell and force. That is the clear path. Okay, right, new part 4, the swim. So we'll remember from Marcus the idea of the inner citadel, which Pierre Hadot wrote so beautifully about. Now, in this section, I want us to look at the positive doctrines of the Buddha in the Dhammapada and what it has to say about cultivating awareness. Awareness. Juan Mascaro translates this as watchfulness, but Roebuck translates it as awareness. And I think awareness is better. So this is referring to chapter 2 of the Dhammapada. Watchfulness or awareness. Now, interestingly here, and this has a bearing on the way that we might think about the Buddha as a philosopher, and not as a kind of prophet mystic. Nibbana, we will know it as nirvana, but Nibbana, because that's how it's spelled in Pali, the language of the Dhammapada. Nibbana is described as an internal or inner mental state. It's not about floating into heaven. Nibbana is described as the peace supreme and the infinite joy. Now, the Dhammapada is encouraging the listener, the reader, to cultivate an awareness that will result in a condition of joy. And the ways in which, and this comes up later in something that is part of the Dhammapada but not one of your readings, the Brahmin, the wise, well, the figure of the sage for the Buddha is quite similar to the figure of the wise or the sage in Greek Stoicism. Now, for the Buddha, the wise person is somebody who conquers thoughtlessness and ascends the palace of wisdom. So wisdom is described in terms of contemplation, deep thinking. The wise is also alone, the inner citadel, a place of solitude, of quietness away from others. The Buddha describes the wise person as having climbed a mountain and looking down at the unwise from a plain. The wise person makes an island for their soul which many waters cannot overflow. Like a citadel, I suppose, a castle, a tower, a place that cannot be touched, a place that is protected. But again, it also involves training. The Buddha says the wise man is like a swift horse that runs his race, outrunning those who are slow. I'm probably labouring it a bit, aren't I? But this is, we might want to contrast here analogies to wrestling in Seneca, dancing, acting, Cicero. But let's think about this one that comes up a bit, which is swimming. And if anyone's a long distance swimmer, maybe this might resonate with you. So the goal for the Buddha is to escape suffering and fear. That's come up quite a bit already. And this is a great struggle, but the struggle is possible. The Buddha describes how most people are on one side of the river and they're walking along the banks, but they can't get to the other side. They can't swim. The current is too hard. That's because they're too caught, as the Buddha thinks, in the world of desire and craving. From verses 212 and 213. Quote, "From pleasure arises sorrow, and from pleasure arises fear. If a man is free from pleasure, he is free from fear and sorrow. From passion arises sorrow, and from passion arises fear. If a man is free from passion, he is free from fear and sorrow." If we free ourselves from pleasure, from passion, we begin to get further upstream. We are described as, we become part of what are called the Udam Soto, he who goes upstream. We're going against the current of passions and worldly life, and in exchange, the infinite. There are a few different analogies to water in this text, and you know from previous class I'm interested in analogies and metaphors and what they tell us about how people think. And we saw we saw this influence of Heraclitus, didn't we, under Marcus Aurelius? Heraclitus, you never step into the same river twice. Now, interestingly, rather than the Buddha talking about us being caught in the flow like this, instead the Buddha gives a sense of agency, that we swim in the flow, we swim in the water. The wise persons is also described as being like a lake that is pure and peaceful and deep. There was that imagery earlier of controlling the channels of water so that the water doesn't flow over you. In one place it's described, as being like a village that can be overrun with water. We don't want that to happen. So we need to make channels to manage and regulate the passions, to become free of the passions. But this isn't easy at all. Few can swim upstream, and there's an emphasis a lot on solitude and on not having a home, being homeless. Think of verse 88. "Let the wise man leave his home life and go into a life of freedom. In solitude that few enjoy, let him find his joy supreme, free from possessions, free from desires, and free from whatever may darken his mind." But you might be thinking here about the Buddha's son and his wife. You might be asking, what would we want? Why would we want to be free from all possessions or free from desires? These are the kinds of things that Kohelet, narrative Ecclesiastes, said make life wonderful, make life good. Your wife, your friends, food and drink. But this is something different. So we had the analogy of swimming, we also get the analogy of bird flight, of being like a swan that flies into the horizon. So to fly like a bird into the horizon, to swim upstream. This is the power of somebody using their own mind, contemplates and recognizes mortality for what it is, and learns to non-attach or detach, we might debate this in class, themselves from cravings to sensual pleasure, from desires that have a hold over us. Now let's just explore these features a little bit more. So what are the features of this path that we're talking about, the swim? Well, a lot, as it comes up again and again, it's mental self-discipline, mental training. One analogy is used of straightening arrows so they can be fired. Training, discipline. Big part of this is awareness of samsara, awareness of the transience of things, awareness of human mortality. There's a lot of discussion of meditation, I suppose, contemplation, self-possession. These are the conditions of the wise versus the fool. You also get, I suppose, an emphasis on acting and not just speaking. Self-sufficiency, solitude, loneliness, being homeless, having a well-guarded mind, free from the passions, well-guarded, like a garrison. Sigmund Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, describes the superego, this authoritarian source of social morality, which berates and tells us off all the time. He describes it as like a garrison in a conquered town. Now, maybe the Buddha would approve. Having a well-guarded mind, a garrison in a conquered town. But what would it mean to be without desire? Would you want that? Now, you maybe, you smarty pants might have figured out here that, hold on a minute, the Buddha actually desires something. The Buddha desired enlightenment, didn't he? He was going to sit on that tree and be enlightened, or he's going to die. But then he desires to teach. So he's desiring. Okay, but what's happening here with desire is slightly different. It's not just to be completely cold, to have no emotions, to be completely loveless. It's that thing that we got in our Stoics, to not be under the spell of titillation and sensual pleasures, but to experience a sense of contentment or joy. The Buddha distrusts desires, but not like benevolent desires, if that makes sense. Not the desire to do good for others. That's key, isn't it? To live harmoniously with others. What the Buddha wants to warn about is desires that lead to dependency and to vulnerability. So one of the things that they warn against is, don't drink alcohol. And there's a lot of stuff there about kind of self moderation and things like this. Now you might think, well, hold on a minute, I like a glass of wine in the evening. But what the Buddha's trying to get at is, if he's asking us if we are serious about not experiencing any sense of anxiety or shame or fear, then we need to kind of take a leap. We need to make the swim. If we didn't feel any fear or sorrow, would there be nothing to us? Maybe the pessimist among you would say, yes. Only fear makes us live. If we kind of invert something from the poet Garcia Lorca, only mystery makes us live. Only fear makes us live. Hobbes would say that's the condition of politics. We need fear. But Buddha said, well, what if we didn't feel any fear or any anxiety? Maybe we would feel great. Maybe we would feel joy. We would feel compassion. We'd be active about compassion. Be more altruistic. So these are some thoughts. Rather than being completely closed off and cold, we might be more engaged with others. We'd have more bandwidth, as we say nowadays, for other people. More compassionate, more accepting. I don't know, there's different ways of reading it. And when Baghini is discussing this, he talks about a poem, one of the sutras, called The Rhinoceros. And you've got here Albrecht Dürer's The Rhinoceros. The life of solitude. Solitude versus community. In this Buddhist verse, we're told to live like a rhinoceros. One whose mind, quote, one whose mind is enmeshed in sympathy for friends and companions neglects the true goal. Seeing this danger in intimacy, wander alone like a rhinoceros. I don't know. I mean, there's that strand of things definitely, but there is the emphasis on community in other parts too. Different directions. Okay, right. So in this next bit, we are going to look at some Greek ideas about fate and freedom. We're just going to use them briefly to contrast the agency which is sketched out, made possible in the Dhammapada. So fate. I like the image that I found there. Those little balls, the little marbles in the wooden maze. So let's take our minds back to the Greek Stoics: Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and the three topoi, the three things that any good Stoic needs to understand: logic, ethics, and physics, this understanding of nature. We haven't said that much yet about the physics. I'm just going to use this as a bit of an aside here so we can think about fate, because I'd like us to talk about fate. I know we have mentioned previously Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate. You might also be thinking of EGF, the eternal return, of embracing what comes, accepting what comes. Let's think about this in a slightly scientific way, because remember, our Stoics are interested in the natural sciences. We're going to look at the ideas of Chrysippus, the major Greek Stoic, but someone whose writings do not survive really. They only really survive as quotations by other people. So Chrysippus talks about the cosmos. He says, the cosmos is one and finite, being held together by a single power. That's why he describes it as something eternal, continuous, and ordered motion. Slightly more substantially, enough commentator, quoting Chrysippus. This is a direct quote from Chrysippus. Fate is a sempiternal and unchangeable series and chain of things, rolling and unraveling itself through eternal sequences of cause and effect. And endless sequences of cause and effect, but understood as defined by one overarching system. Now the Buddha talks about the end of cycles of birth and death and so on. Our Stoics have a vision also of the cosmos, so something that is one. Everything that exists is material, but it's held together by a single power, a single force, pneuma, it's kind of creative force. But every effect follows a cause, and the Greek Stoics are deterministic, which raises a difficult question about freedom and what choices we have to act or don't act, which has an interesting bearing on what we're talking about here with the Buddha. This is Chrysippus. You might remember he had a slightly comical death, according to Diogenes. So Chrysippus in his writings deals with this problem of fate and free will. So if everything in the universe is determined by prior causes, then human beings are also determined by prior causes, and probably if you had a really clever computer, you'd be able to kind of trace and understand everything that is going to happen to everybody. We'd all just be puppets at the whims of the gods. In which case, there'd be no need for philosophy, would there? We just accept what there is, live in accordance with nature. But remember, our Stoics are really interested in ethics, in how we live with an understanding of nature. And Chrysippus makes some useful remarks, which I think are worth bearing in mind in relation to the Buddha and what we've talked about already. So Chrysippus was kind of challenged by people at the time. Well, hold on a minute. If everything is driven by fate, then it doesn't really matter what you do. You can just behave how you like. There's no point. We can't change anything anyway. And part of his thinking does lend to that. One of the things that he teaches is that we should accept things and accept ourselves for what we are. This is a quote from Plutarch. Since the organization of the universe proceeds thus, it is necessary for us to be such as we are, in accordance with it, whether we are ill or lame, contrary to our individual nature, or whether we have turned out to be grammarians or musicians. Okay, so we accept things as they are, we accept ourselves as they are. But yet he then makes this point against criticism about how while things are fated, the things that affect us aren't just external events, but what also affects us is the condition of our minds and the strength of our minds to respond to the external events that are fated. And it's this kind of training of quality of mind that Chrysippus encourages, because if we can understand things that happen to us and we can understand our reactions to them, and if we can train our disposition, then we can live a life that is marked less by suffering, as the Buddha would say, marked less by the passions, as the Greek Stoics would say, and would be closer to reason and the truth. Quote, For if our minds were originally formed by nature in a sound and useful manner, then they pass on all the force of fate which imposes on us from outside in a relatively unobjectionable and more acceptable way. But if, on the other hand, they are rough and untrained and uncouth, supported by no good training, then even if the blows of fated misfortune which strike them are trivial or non-existent, they will plunge headlong into the constant misdeeds and errors. And this is another quote. For many things cannot occur without our being willing and indeed contributing a most strenuous eagerness and zeal for these things, since it was fated for these things to occur in conjunction with their personal effort. This is Botticelli's The Spring. Maybe one thing that is probably a legacy of the kind of the frugal personality of Zeno. There is a kind of coldness about the passions in the Greek Stoics, whereas I think, at least in terms of the Buddha and his outlook, and maybe in Ecclesiastes too, there's a great warmth. There is, yes, there are the endless cycles. Yes, life is defined by death and suffering and so on, but there are also moments and opportunities for joy and love and compassion. Spring. Okay, the final part. Japanese cherry blossom, an important festival in Japan. What can we say about it? Again, I'm drawing on Julian Bergini's book, How the World Thinks. There's a really nice discussion of the cherry blossom festivals. Now in Japan, there's a celebration of the beauty of the blossom. Of course, we saw it a couple of months ago in the UK. Blossom is beautiful, but blossom only is around for a brief spell of time. We need to enjoy it now. Life is transient, but then that doesn't mean that we just need to kind of meditate on the worst aspects of it, of all the sadness and loss, but we can enjoy and celebrate the beauty of the transience too. What the Buddha encourages in different parts of the Dhammapada is a sense of deep contemplation and a love of nature and a love of nature's transience. This isn't totally cold. Yes, detach yourselves from desires, but do not feel nothing. It's about joy. This comes up quite nicely in verses 49 and 50, where the Buddha calls on us to live virtuously with nature, meditating not on other people's faults, but on our own. This is the point that you might have remembered in Marcus Aurelius. Verse 49. As the bee takes the essence of a flower and flies away without destroying its beauty and perfume, so let the sage wander in this life. Think not of the faults of others, of what they have done or not done. Think rather of your own sins, of the things you have done or not done. And this is another image from Japanese blossom season. Now this is a very kind of Stoic idea, isn't it? To kind of meditate things that are within our control. To not blame others, to live in harmony with others. To recognize the fragility of life in order to value it more, not less. And this emphasis is more in the Dhammapada than in Stoic writings, leads to compassion. There's a lot of compassion in chapter 10, or even chapter 15. Chapter 10 talks about when we recognize that all things are mortal, then we do not want to harm them anymore. All beings tremble before danger, all fear death. When a man considers this, he does not kill or cause to kill. So the Buddha describes life as dear to all, and we're in a kind of a living community. It's almost like the community of breath in Ecclesiastes of Hevel. All beasts share one breath, human beings and animals. Marcus Aurelius encourages us to think of the parts being all interdependent as one whole. The Dhammapada calls on us to live compassionately and to live in joy and love among those who hate or are ill. That's why things like vegetarianism is an important part of that. Now this is a quote from the Majjhima Nikaya, and it's about living, it's a philosophy of love, if that makes sense. If men speak evil of you, this must you think. I should say this is another text from the Buddha, or attributed to the Buddha. Our hearts shall not waver, and we will abide in compassion, in loving kindness, without resentment. We will think of the man who speaks ill of us with thoughts of love, and in our thoughts of love shall we dwell. And from that abode of love, we will fill the whole world with far-reaching, wide-spreading, boundless love. Now you might be thinking, that sounds great, but that sounds impossible. It sounds too difficult to attain. Verse 183 of the Dhammapada also kind of lays out another kind of deceptively simple message. Do not what is evil, do what is good. Keep your mind pure. This is the teaching of Buddha. Now, in the commentaries, there's a whole rich tradition of commentaries on the Dhammapada. If you read the Roebuck edition, she gives these great summaries of the commentaries. Basically, for each verse, there is like an anecdote, basically, that kind of teaches the message, usually in relation to the Buddha's life or some animals or something. Now, in relation to verse 183, the key one, the Buddha's teaching, a soldier wants to study and understand the Buddha's teachings. And so he kind of studies under a monk. And then he hears this, and the soldier says, every child of 5 knows this, do not what is evil. But then the monk replies, it may be so, but few men of 80 can practice it. So this, I think, is a way of thinking about what Buddhism is trying to do, and that's why there's such a big differentiation between the monks and nuns and ordinary people. There is this vision of a life of enlightenment, of self-denial, of joy and compassion, but the expectation isn't there that everyone is going to live like this. That's not there. There is a kind of morality for most folk, compassion and joy, and then there is a kind of the more stringent teachings. Now, Juan Mascaro, the translator of the Dhammapada, just to end this, talks about this being a philosophy of joy, and maybe this is something that we can also discuss among loads of stuff on Monday. This is from the end of his introduction, which is quite beautiful. He says, the message of the Buddha is a message of joy. He found a treasure and he wants us to follow the path that leads to the treasure he found. He tells man that he is in deep darkness, but he also tells him that there is a path that leads to light. He wants us to arise from a life of dreams into a higher life where man loves and does not hate, where man helps and does not hurt. His appeal is universal because he appeals to reason and to the universal in us all. Okay, so I want us to discuss these things on Monday. As a whole group, why is transience such a problem? Maybe the smaller groups, what is the status of reason and mental self-discipline, the swim? Number 3, does this text offer a satisfactory response to the problem of suffering? This is probably huge. Maybe I should have got rid of that question. But I want us to use that question to try and think about how we fit this reading within other Stoic sources that we've looked at, and maybe in relation to some of the questions, ethical and social questions that we've raised already. And then for the following week, we are going to look at Michel and Montaigne. We're going to look at something completely different. We're going to look at the revival of actual Stoic ideas in early modern Europe. If we had loads of time, we'd look at a guy called Justus Lipsius, but we won't. But I'll probably teach a bit about him. We're going to look at Montaigne, an amazing essayist. We're going to look at his final essay in the essays, which is a longer one, Off Experience. I also wanted to try and kind of listen or read Shakespeare's Hamlet or watch it. We're going to think about early modern Stoicism, but actually Hamlet and Montaigne are not quite Stoics. There's a lot of Stoicism in their thinking, but they're also offering responses to Stoicism, challenges to the sage, skepticism about what we can control and what we cannot. Okay. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.